Well, hi, everybody. I am so excited to have Luann with us today. She's a member of our Mindful Eating support community, and she has agreed to share a recent episode of overeating in order to help us demonstrate how you can use the mindful eating cycle to deconstruct an overeating episode. This is something that we do regularly in our mindful eating support community. I lead these group coaching calls, and so people can bring a situation to the call and we can walk through it. The important thing is that I want to show you and demonstrate for you how we use the mindful eating cycle in that process. Because the mindful eating cycle really gives us the structure that we need in order to think through exactly what happened and to begin to sort of unravel the pieces a bit so that we can have a better understanding of what the situation was. So if you would, Luann, just start with a brief description of what happened.
Um, I went to a cocktail party with appetizers that was in the afternoon with a group of women that in a group that I belong to. So it was around 3:30. And then after the party, I came home and overate.
Interesting. I personally can recall a number of times when I used to do that, and it's sort of an interesting phenomenon to me that, we'd been at a party, had some great food, and then overeat afterwards. So
Right.
I think this might be a helpful one for other people to think about too. But please, everybody, the reason we're doing this is not necessarily this specific episode, but really to understand the process of thinking through an episode. So
Right.
we're going to use the mindful eating cycle. The mindful eating cycle, just as a reminder, is 6 decision points in a circle, and one leads to the other, leads to the other. And I kind of like to think about picturing a clock. That's helpful to me in order to understand where each decision point is. I also recognize I keep doing this, which might actually appear backward on your video. So just mentally turn everything around that I'm saying. But the mindful eating cycle always starts with why. Why did I eat? That's there up there at 12 o'clock, right up at the top. And then the next decision point is when. When did I feel like eating, or when did I eat? After that is what did I eat? So I felt like eating. What did I choose to eat? And then next is how did I eat it? How did it get into my body? Next is how much did I eat? In other words, when did I stop? And then last is where did I invest the energy I consumed, or where did the fuel go? In other words, how did I feel afterward? What did I do afterward? So why, when, what, how much, and where. And when I'm working with somebody on this, I will actually draw the cycle out and then I will write notes next to each decision point. And that'll also lead me back to asking some additional questions. So, Luann, I'm going to start with when. Everybody, it is so much easier to start with when than why. Just skip the why at first, because the why really reveals itself as you work your way through the cycle. So when you start with when, that's pretty concrete. I have down here 3:30, an afternoon cocktail party. I'm going to assume that meant like appetizer, food, and drinks.
Everyone was to bring an appetizer or a dessert, and there was wine. So that was the cocktail part.
Okay. All right. So this 3:30 time is kind of funny because it's not quite dinner, but several hours after lunch, et cetera. Do you remember how hungry you were about the time you started eating at the party?
I was hungry, and I had purposefully sort of planned my meal so that I would be hungry at that time.
Excellent. Excellent. Let's pause there for a second. I want to just clarify, because some of the people watching this might not have ever used our approach before, but they might be familiar with dieting. And I can remember in my old diet days, if I had a party, I would starve myself all day long so I could afford to eat high point foods, or I would save up my points or whatever. Um, that tended to backfire on me. So it sounds to me like that wasn't what you did. What was different for you in the way that you approached this?
I ate breakfast, probably a little bit late, like for me, maybe 10 o'clock. And I purposefully didn't eat quite as much breakfast as I usually do,
Mm-hmm.
so that by the time 3:30 came around, I was hungry, and I hadn't eaten anything else before
Okay,
that.
so 4 or 5 hours
Yeah,
later, you wanted a meal.
right.
Okay, good. Now we use a hunger and fullness scale to kind of rate our level of hunger and fullness. And again, Luann's familiar with it, but you might not be. It goes from 1 to 10. 1 means famished, so hungry you'll eat the chair you're sitting on. 10 is so full you feel like you could pop. And 5 is somewhere in the middle, neutral. So do you know what hunger level you would give yourself at that point?
I think I was about a 3.
Okay, so hungry,
Hungry.
not
But
famished and out of
yeah,
control, but you were significantly hungry.
yeah.
Okay. Right. So, anything else in terms of when you felt like eating? Were there any other emotions going on? Any excitement? Any dread? Do you have any social anxiety? Was there anything else that might have been contributing at that point?
Um, Social situations are often a little bit, I feel a little bit apprehensive going into them. So I definitely felt that. And um, I would say a little excitement too about seeing some of these people that I hadn't seen in a long time. But the making conversation, small talk is sometimes hard for me to sort of get going with that. So there was some heightened anxiety, I would say.
Okay. And that's so common, which is what made me think to ask. It's very, very common. A lot of times people aren't really aware that they're using food to give themselves something to do, something to kind of make their hands busy, their mouth busy, something to soothe themselves or distract themselves from a little bit of that social anxiety or, even just the run of the mill. How do you talk to people you haven't seen in 6 months? So,
Right, right.
okay. All right. And then what did you eat at the party? Was there anything in particular that you recall, anything that stood out?
Um,
Or how did you approach that?
well, I really looked at, I tried to look at the whole table and decide what things looked tastiest or things that I wouldn't normally have or eat. So I had, it was a dinner size plate, and I had, I don't know, 10 things maybe, just little, there were little bites of this and that. I don't remember anything particularly. But it was, I don't, and this, well, this is getting ahead of myself, but it's part of the problem of, is this enough? Is this, it's feeling, okay, I've got this plate of 10 things, and I don't know, will that be enough? Will I want to come back? All those things that sometimes are going through your mind.
Yeah, I don't, it's maybe not an issue for everybody, but for me personally, I find it a little tricky. Appetizer foods sometimes don't feel the same as a meal, like sitting down to a hamburger, a piece of chicken. Is that part of it at all for
Yes,
you?
that's absolutely part of it. And I had told myself going in, it's like, you haven't, this is a meal. You're using this party as a meal.
Mhm.
Um, but then it's, I look at these little things on the plate and I go, is this really a meal? I don't know.
Right. See, if I could just pause here, this is an important reflection that Luann is doing right here because a lot of mindfulness is about becoming curious about the things that we think. Like this brain that is constantly talking to us about whatever we're doing. And oftentimes when we're mindless, we have no idea that the brain is having this conversation of, is this a meal? Is this enough? Am I going to get to eat later? Is this going to taste good? If I have to get up and get more, will people notice? We sort of have these unconscious conversations and they really affect what we eat and how much we eat. But until we're conscious that they're even there, we're not even going to understand why we're doing what we're doing.
Right.
All right, so you've got all this kind of an assortment of food, maybe a little bit of self-talk about whether this really counts as a meal. Was the food good?
It was good. Yeah.
So you enjoyed it. How did you eat it? How did you actually consume your plate of food?
Um, I did sit down with a group of friends, and I was paying fairly close attention, although I was talking more than I usually do. So I was sort of a little bit distracted in that sense of sort of having a conversation and doing some talking and yet eating at the same time.
Yeah, I find myself, this just happened yesterday. We had a family event and some of the food was really delicious. And I actually noticed myself feeling a little bit annoyed that I was having to have this conversation when really what I wanted to do is just taste this delicious food. I finally ended up getting up and getting another small piece of this thing, just eating it without being around anybody
Right.
else that I had to talk to. So oh, it's funny. Okay. All right. So you were a little bit distracted. Did you end up going back to the buffet for another plate of food or more of anything?
I did go back and get the host had made a bowl of chili, and I'd seen, I didn't realize that it was there. It was in another part of the house, and some other people had. I said, "Oh, I want to try that." So I went and got a little bowl of chili, had some cheese, had a few Fritos on it, and came back and ate that sitting down.
Okay. All right.
So
And then anything else?
yeah, and then actually, someone came and brought in a little plate of a number of desserts that we were going to share with this little group where I was sitting, and I probably had a bite or two of three different things.
Okay. All right. And so how are you feeling now? Where is the energy? Do you know what your hunger and fullness number would have been around then?
Um, I think I was probably about a 6.
Okay. So full. You could
Oh,
feel the food in
yeah,
your stomach. You weren't miserable, but you were full.
right.
Okay. All right. Anything else about that situation?
Um, no, I don't think so. I think that was
So had it ended there, would you have called that, yep, that was a, nice party, good food, I was a little full, but I felt okay. Is that kind of where you would have left that
I think
situation?
so. Yeah, I think I would have been. I think maybe I would have, you know, I don't know. I feel like even if I'd left it there, I might have felt somewhat unsatisfied just because I was not really tuned in to the fact that this was a meal.
Okay, so that's important. So at the end then, you were feeling emotionally unsatisfied.
Yes.
Physically, you were fine,
Right.
6 or so, you were fine, but you've just something your brain or your emotions didn't feel satisfied. So this is for all of you watching, this is an important point because satisfaction is not just the amount of food you eat, it's also about the brain being satisfied as well. And there's a number of factors that can affect how satisfied you feel when you eat. And Luann has actually mentioned several of them. One of them might be with the kind of food you eat. So you didn't mention it here, but you said you surveyed the buffet or surveyed the food first and took what you wanted, right? I mean, is that
Right.
okay? So sometimes especially if we have a lot of old diet talk, we'll go and we'll take the vegetables or the salad or the fruit or the whatever. What we really want are the meatballs and the, cheese and crackers and the other things. And then we eat all this other stuff, but we don't feel satisfied afterwards. And then we end up eating the food that we brought on the way home in the front seat of the car. People have done it before.
That's right. That's right.
So that can be one reason we don't feel satisfied. Another that you mentioned was a little bit of distraction while we're eating. We're eating physically, the food is getting into our body, but we're not fully present and aware and tasting it. And so we get done and it's like, oh, I wish I just had a little bit more of that. That's what happened to me with that family party.
Right.
Um, and then I think, other reasons we can feel dissatisfied is that the thought process. One of the thoughts that can happen, and you described it, is, oh, this wasn't a real meal. It didn't count, or it didn't feel like I sat down with a knife and a fork and a main course and a side dish and a salad. So mentally, the old messages about appetizers don't count is really about us getting into our heads instead of into our physical body, right? Okay, so that's a good awareness. That's something cool. Is there anything you would do different just from that perspective? Anything that you learned from this from that perspective?
Um, I think maybe being a little more curious about how I was feeling in the party, like maybe even, when I stepped away to get the chili, I could have sort of checked in with myself and thought, how am I feeling? Where am I on the hunger scale? And is there anxiety driving what I'm eating, or and maybe just being more attentive to the fact that, if this is, I can have something else later if this is not, if it's not a meal, if I don't feel like it's a meal, that's okay. I can have something later. And that's, that often takes away that immediacy of thinking, oh my gosh, everything has to be perfect right now. And,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, and it's hard too. And I think these party situations or these appetizer or meal situations or buffet situations are tricky because there is this sense that I have to have it now. I won't get a chance. I've got to try her chili now. I won't have a chance to eat it later. It's a little uncomfortable, but I don't know if it's the worst thing in the world to say, gosh, this looks so good and I'm full. Can I take a little cup for later?
mhm,
Or I'd love your recipe. I'd like to try that. I'd like to try to make this or whatever. But,
right,
again, it's about awareness in that present moment of what's really going on. What am I really thinking?
right.
But I recall from the beginning that that wasn't really the overeating episode,
No,
that happened later. And so
right.
for all of you watching, be aware that sometimes there is an eating cycle that leads into a second eating cycle or even a third or a fourth eating cycle. So we're just going to start again here. And what happened after?
I took my sister home after the party, and I went in to her house, and she had brought little pigs in blankets, and I'd had a couple at the party. And I'm just, they're right in front of us. We're standing at the bar and chatting, and she picked one up and ate it. And I thought, well, I'm going to pick one up and eat it. And so I did. Um, and then that was it for there. Then I left, and she sent some home with me, and I got home, and my partner was just finishing dinner, and I said, "Do you want any of these, pigs in blankets?" And he said, "Yeah, I'll try one." So I put him, I said, "Well, I'm going to have a couple too." So I put them in the toaster oven to heat them up. And then I thought, oh, I'm going to get some of this dip out. I had made this goat cheese dip that was really good. So I thought, I'm going to get that out and have a few crackers with that. So that was really what put me over the top in terms of fullness.
So you got home, I'm guessing several hours later, right?
Like
What are we talking,
6:30. Yeah,
6:30 or so? Okay, so 6:30, he's eating dinner. You've
right,
supposedly already had dinner, at least that was the idea, right? And then you had a couple or pig in a blanket at your sister's,
yeah,
a couple more with him, and then the chips and the dip. You
right.
were sitting down having conversation with him at this point?
Um, yes, we were both sitting down. Yeah,
Okay. So this is the how decision point.
right.
Sitting, eating. All right. And it doesn't sound like a lot of food. Like if you were just eating that for dinner, probably that
Yeah,
wouldn't have been a lot of food. It was that it was on top of what you had already eaten that put you
exactly.
over. Okay.
Right, right.
All right. And then afterward, where would you say your hunger and fullness level was
I
after
was
that
I
time?
was probably a 7.
Okay. All right. Okay. And what describe for the group, what does a 7 feel like to you?
Um, I can definitely feel food in my stomach, which is also a 6, but it's a little bit more than that. It's, my stomach's a little bit stretched. Often I feel a little bit tired. I'm a little bit lethargic, I guess. often I think, might be nice to lie down, that kind of thing.
Yeah, almost sounds to me like you're almost getting to an 8 at that point,
Maybe,
right?
yeah,
By
maybe
that point.
so.
And of course, it always takes a little while after eating to get that full level of fullness. So as you look back at it, now we're at the why. The why was the first decision point, but we skipped that one until we worked our way through. What is your thought about what drove that second eating cycle?
I think for me, and I've noticed this as a pattern in the past, is that when I transition from a social event to coming home, I often feel the urge to keep eating.
Mhm.
And I think it has to, some of it is, let's just, keep the party going. It was so much fun. I don't want to sort of settle down into being at home.
Mhm.
There's that. And then on the other side of it is also, I'm pretty tired. I'm sort of overstimulated from being with all these people. And I just want to have some downtime. And, so it's a weird sort of dichotomous thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
But food sounds like it would be something that would help that. That's
Yeah.
sort of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I like that. So it keeps the party going and at the same time kind of transitions you into just a quiet evening.
Right.
And then we don't have to talk about the alcohol on board that sort of
Exactly.
adds to all of that. So,
Right. Right.
okay. Anything you would do different the second time, that second episode of eating? Anything in reflection that maybe could have helped you
I
more?
often when when I transition from a social event, I often realize that I'm thirsty, um, that I think sitting and having a glass of water or sparkling water or something sort of calms that urge to eat. And it's also, again, it's taking a minute, changing my clothes, sitting with Ken and talking to him. So it's thinking through having something. And I think at the time I was thinking that even planning a little activity, like, okay, I'm going to sit and do a crossword puzzle,
Mm.
or I'm going to work on my Christmas cards, or, that there was, if I've just had, just sort of reflected on it a little bit and maybe thought maybe this would be a good way to transition, because I know it's a setup for me sometimes.
So that I think that's another really important point is part of the process is really beginning to understand what our triggers are, what as you said called a setup. When are we going to be most vulnerable to overeating? And as we begin to reflect on those without judgment. So one of the things I want you to really notice about Luann is she's not beating herself up. She's not telling us how bad she was and how many calories or carbs she ate, and I'm not doing that either because that is not helpful. What is helpful here is to be able to look at a situation without judgment, to be curious and aware, to wonder what the thoughts and feelings might have been and what the situational triggers, or in this case, even the physical triggers like fatigue, thirst, and then be able to say, okay, I'm learning more about myself and what makes me vulnerable, and what could I do differently next time? And you said a couple times I could pause. I could stop and reflect before I go and get that next thing. And I think that that's really what mindfulness is all about is in the present moment, what can I do? How can I stop the autopilot flight from going from one food to the next food to the next and really understand or make a conscious decision about what I'm going to do next.
That's right.
Thank you so much. I know you've been doing this work, and I really appreciate that you continue to do this work. I really like to think of it as a process, and that we just get better and better and better at it, and learn more and more and more about ourselves as we go. And so I appreciate you letting us eavesdrop in on your experience and on your process. Thank you so much, Luann.
I really appreciate being here, Michelle. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.